Hey, what's up guys? So it's Sunday and I'm finishing the finishing touches up on this white oak desk. This is going to be a veneered white oak desk. And this is going to be my first project for Maker's Mob, but I will be posting the same project on my channel like always. The project on my channel will be between probably 8 and 12 minutes. And on Maker's Mob, it'll probably be close to an hour because all the little details that you just can't include on a video on YouTube will be on the Maker's Mob. So definitely check it out, my Maker's Mob. I'll have a link in the description. Before I get to the tools that I think are the essential tools for a shop, at least for me, I just want to answer a quick question because I got a question on my Instagram from Bob about the tape that I'm using to tape out. I don't know where it is right now, but I'm using the yellow frog tape. And he asked me, do I like the yellow frog tape better than the blue tape? And I do. You get a cleaner line. There's yellow, which is kind of doesn't have as strong as an adhesive, and then there's the green. I often use the yellow. So that's my opinion about Frog Tape's not a sponsor. I definitely want them to be a sponsor one day, but they're not a sponsor. It just happens to be what I use. And they did send me a bunch a couple of years ago, so I don't have to buy it. So as far as what I think are the essential shop tools, I posted a video on the first tools I think every woodworker or DIYer should buy the other day, and of course people said you need to get a table saw first, which I didn't include that in the first 5 tools because that's not what I think. So now let's go over to the table saw and talk about the 5 tools. I'm not going to say in what order because you really kind of need all of them. So we'll start at the table saw. First of all, I should say you eventually will use all of them. You don't really need all of them. You can get away without using a lot of tools. Like a joiner, you can get away with not having a jointer because a lot of the material you buy, you can buy it with a straight line rip, or you'll buy material that's S4S, which is sanded and surfaced on 4 sides, so you already have a joint edge. But it's a handy tool, but not the first one. So let's talk about the table saw first. The reason why I didn't include a table saw for the first tool anybody wanting to get into woodworking or DIY projects should buy is because in my opinion, the table saw is the most dangerous tool in the shop. The tool that I have, or the table saw that I have, is a Powermatic. I bought it used more than 20 years ago. I bought it for $1,500. It has a Biesmeyer fence. That's really key, having a good fence. It's a locking T-square fence with a tape measure on the fence. It's a 50-inch fence. The table saw has a 3 horsepower motor and it plugs into a 220 receptacle. I often get a lot of grief about not having a riving knife. Why don't you use a riving knife? Because I bought this saw used and it didn't come with a riving knife. And I've been woodworking so long that the first shop that I worked at, none of the saws had riving knives. So I'm used to it. I'm not saying it's a good idea. This one simply doesn't have a riving knife. The saw that I would suggest to anybody getting into woodworking, my good friend Mike, who's a surgeon, so his hands are very important. He wants to get into woodworking, and I said to him, get a saw stop. Because half the people I know who have been woodworking have cut their finger at some point or another, including myself. The way I cut my finger was a stupid thing. It was a long time ago. But what I was doing was running a thin piece of wood through the saw, and it kind of started to pull away from the fence a little bit. And for whatever reason, not thinking, I used my left hand to try to hold the material up tight. It kicked back and dragged my finger over the saw. Now, luckily, it didn't even require a stitch, but it was really scary. And I saw somebody do the very similar procedure as me, and they ended up cutting their finger in half, about 3/8 down the index fingernail. So I would always suggest anybody getting into this, they don't have a saw, buy a saw stop. And always buy a good table saw if you're really going to get into it. So that's number 1, the table saw. Then these now are in no order. These are just the tools that I use just about, maybe not every day, but at least every week. The table saw I use every day. So let's go over to the chop saw, which I think is probably the next most used. So I just called this a chop saw. I probably should have called it a miter saw. This is the Bosch. It's got the kind of articulating arm, I think they call that. I think it's pretty good, but you don't need to get this one. You can buy one for probably a lot less than this one. I actually don't use the chop saw or this miter saw for cutting miters. If you watch the show, you know that I use my 10-inch Hitachi with what I call a sacrificial fence for making miter cuts. I usually just kind of break down wood into smaller measurements, and then I do most of my important cross cuts on the table saw with a crosscut sled. This is my bandsaw. It's definitely a very useful tool. This is the 14-inch Delta, and I bought this saw I think when I was about 18 or 19 years old. I bought this saw and I bought my first table saw at the same time, and my first table saw was a 10-inch Delta contractor saw, and both the bandsaw and the Delta contractor saw are the saws that I learned with, or that I used when I worked at the Woodworker, and that's going back to being a junior in high school. So that's what I was familiar with. I don't even think saw stop was invented at that point. I had the 10-inch contractor saw for probably 10 years before then selling that and buying the Powermatic. Since I mentioned it, this is my Hitachi 10-inch miter saw, and you can see I set it up with a sacrificial fence. If you don't know what I'm talking about the sacrificial fence, I've got a video on my channel, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But for all of my frame making or picture framing, flat panels and doors, all of my miters are generally cut on this saw using a sacrificial fence. You can see that this fence is in pretty rough shape, and I'll probably replace it pretty soon. Usually I replace a sacrificial fence maybe every 4 to 6 weeks. This is my jointer. It's an 8-inch Delta, and this I bought, going back years and years, probably shortly after buying the bandsaw and the table saw. It's a great tool, but I wouldn't call it a necessity. You can definitely get away without having a jointer. It's definitely convenient when you have one, but at the same time they're expensive and they take up a lot of space in the shop. Not only in the footprint, but in the in-feed and the out-feed. The reason why I don't think you need a jointer is because, in fact, most of the material that I use is S4S, which stands for surfaced on 4 sides. So you've got clean sides on all 4 sides of the board, which means it's going to have a straight edge, and you can run that straight edge against the fence of your table saw. So definitely a handy tool, but not really a necessity. And again, it's expensive. And I wouldn't buy a cheap jointer. If you're going to pull the trigger and buy a jointer, spend the money and get one that you'll have for years and years to come. And the last shop tool I'll mention, and I think that at least in my shop this is more useful than a thickness planer, is a drum sander. I posted a video a few days or maybe a week ago about what I generally use a drum sander for, and for my work, making frames, sanding off the blade marks on pieces of molding, like banding the edge of like the desk that I just made. I think that the drum sander is a huge time saver. So I'm sure a lot of people will say, can't you just do that with a thickness planer? The difference in my view with a thickness planer is you can get a lot of tear out. So if you're working with figured wood or thin strips of wood, the thickness planer will break that piece of wood, where this you could put a thin, 1/8 inch, 3/4 inch piece of molding and sand it flush or sand it flat. And that happens to be what I do often with the kind of work that I do. So that's my suggestions for the tools to think about. And also start slow. Don't buy all the tools at once, because it really depends on the type of work you're doing. With the kind of work that I do, I can get away with buying mostly S4S material, which is, like I mentioned, surfaced on 4 sides. So that's going right to the lumberyard, and you're going to buy that dimensional, either a 1x4 or a 1x6 or 1x8. And when I'm designing furniture, I usually keep that in mind. And part of that has to do with the limitations of my shop. It's a very small shop. The interior space is about 14.5 by 25. So you have to really think about that. If you have a huge shop, well, then you open up the doors to all kinds of tools. and also that's going to come with how expensive those tools are and what's in your budget too. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.